The whole town laughed when he started digging into that snowy hillside, and now they wish they'd laughed less. An old veteran in a thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket came to Duluth, Minnesota, with nothing but a battered shovel, a stubborn will, and his loyal German shepherd, Shadow. He wasn't building a cabin like everyone else, he was carving a home into the earth itself. But when Shadow began growling at a trap door hidden beneath the floorboards, the veteran uncovered something no one expected. A firewood vault built like a fortress, designed to stay bone dry through the deadliest winter. And when the coldest blizzard in decades hit, that secret didn't just save his life. It exposed who was prepared, who was arrogant, and who would come begging in the dark. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below, because it's wild how far these winter survival stories can reach. Winter pressed down on Duluth like a heavy hand, turning Lake Superior's breath into knives of wind and white, drifting silence. Walter Bennett arrived at the edge of town with the kind of quiet a man earns only after life has taken everything loud away from him. He was in his late 60s, broad in the shoulders despite the age in his bones, with a weathered face cut from hard years, sharp cheekbones, a jaw that looked like it had once refused to lose a fight, and a gray beard kept short, more practical than stylish. His eyes were pale and steady, the kind that didn't flinch at bad news because they'd already met worse. Over his layered shirts, he wore the same thing every day, as if it were stitched to his story. A thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket, heavy enough to stop a wind and stubborn enough to outlast a season. People in Duluth didn't know his past. Not really. They only knew he carried himself like a man who had once belonged to something bigger than himself and then watched it vanish. And beside him, padding through the snow with patient confidence, was Shadow, his German shepherd, 5 years old, tall and athletic, with a dense black and tan coat and intelligent amber-brown eyes that seemed to read the world before it happened. Shadow moved like a guardian spirit disguised as a dog, ears always alert, tail low and calm, never wasting energy on fear. If Walter was the old soldier, Shadow was the silent oath that he wouldn't face another winter alone. The property Walter bought sat where the town began to thin out into scrub and frozen grass, a neglected patch of land on a south-facing slope that caught what little sun winter offered. It wasn't much. Just a rough claim with a half-collapsed shed and a view of gray sky that never seemed to fully brighten, but Walter stood there like a man looking at a blank page instead of a mistake. He didn't want pity. He didn't want company. He wanted a place where nobody would ask him to explain the parts of himself that didn't fit into small talk. He'd come to Duluth after years of drifting through jobs that ended the moment winter hit, and employers tightened budgets. After nights spent in cheap rooms with thin walls, where he could hear other people's lives through the drywall like ghosts. The truth he didn't say out loud was simple. He was tired of being temporary. He wanted something that couldn't be taken away by a landlord's signature or a boss's mood. He wanted a shelter that didn't depend on luck. That first morning, the wind tore across the slope, pushing snow sideways like it had a grudge. Walter walked the land slowly, boots crunching, testing the ground with his heel, watching how the drifts formed, how the wind curved around the hill and died behind it. He wasn't admiring the scenery. He was studying the enemy. In the army, he'd learned the difference between surviving and merely being alive, and the difference always came down to preparation. The town itself was a bowl of old brick buildings and weathered storefronts, smoke rising from chimneys, people bundled in thick coats, their lives arranged around warm interiors. But out here, Where the slope met the open air, the cold had room to build speed. Shadow trotted ahead, nose down, tracking something invisible in the snow, then circled back to Walter's side like a loyal scout reporting without words. Walter stopped at the center of the slope, turned his face toward the pale winter sun, and narrowed his eyes. He could already imagine it, a structure not standing tall like a target, but tucked into the earth like a secret. He didn't believe in miracles, not the flashy kind people begged for when they'd run out of planning. He believed in physics, gravity, and the stubborn truth that the ground kept its temperature when the sky went mad. That was where he'd start down. The first shovel bite was almost ceremonial. The steel blade struck frozen dirt with a hard, ringing thud, and the vibration ran up Walter's arms into his shoulders. He leaned into it anyway. The cold tried to steal his breath, but he breathed through it, slow and controlled. He had spent years training his body to obey even when it wanted to quit. The earth didn't give easily at first. It resisted like a locked door. But Walter had opened worse doors. He chipped and scraped, then finally pulled up the first chunk of dark soil, and something in him loosened. Not joy. Not yet. But relief-like he'd found a problem that could be solved with effort instead of begging. Shadow sat a few feet away, watching with his head tilted slightly, as if he were curious about why humans insisted on making life complicated. Every so often the dog stood, paced, then returned to sit again, his breath fogging the air. Walter worked until the sweat under his flannel jacket turned cold against his back. Then he paused, wiped his forehead with the back of his glove, and stared at the shallow cut he'd made in the slope. A small start, a small defiance. He could already hear the laughter that would come. Duluth was a city of people who'd seen enough winters to respect them. But it was also a city where folks judged what they didn't understand. Above-ground cabins made sense. Basements made sense. A man digging into a hillside like a badger with a shovel? That looked like desperation. Walter didn't mind being misunderstood. He'd lived through worse than being called strange. The first neighbor to wander over was a man named Rick Halverson, a thick-necked, broad-chested local in his early 50s with a reddish beard that looked like it had been trimmed with a pocket knife. Rick wore a knit cap pulled low and a canvas work coat stained with old paint and sawdust, the uniform of a man who believed every problem could be fixed with a hammer and a loud opinion. He stood at the edge of Walter's shallow pit, hands on hips, squinting down like he was inspecting a poorly built fence. "You're not planning to put a septic line there, are you?" Rick asked, voice half amused, half concerned. Walter didn't look up right away. He drove the shovel in again, lifted another load of soil, and tossed it behind him with steady efficiency. "No," he said finally. "I'm planning to live there." Rick blinked, then let out a laugh that came out like a bark. "Live in a hole?" He glanced at Shadow, as if expecting the dog to confirm the joke. Shadow just stared back, calm and unimpressed, like a judge waiting for the punchline to improve. Walter rested his hands on the shovel handle and looked up. Close up, his face carried the kind of detail time writes slowly fine lines at the corners of his eyes, a scar near his left eyebrow that cut through gray hair, and a tightness around his mouth that suggested he didn't waste words on people who didn't listen. "Not a hole," Walter said. "A shelter." Rick stepped closer, boots crunching on crusted snow. "You know what happens when spring hits, right? Ground turns to soup. You'll be swimming in mud." Walter nodded once, as if Rick had offered a weather forecast. "That's why you build drainage," he said, "and you pick the right slope." Rick frowned, trying to decide whether this was confidence or stupidity. You got family helping you? Walter's eyes flicked toward Shadow for half a second, and something almost soft moved behind his stern expression. I've got what I need. Rick followed the glance and chuckled. Well, that dog's got more sense than you do, friend. Walter didn't take the bait. He simply returned to work. The shovel moved again. Dirt flew. The pit deepened by inches. Rick lingered a moment longer, as if he expected Walter to crack a smile, to join the joke and admit it was all a misunderstanding. But Walter didn't. Finally, Rick shrugged and walked off, shaking his head, the laughter fading into the wind. By late afternoon, another figure appeared, moving carefully across the slope as if she didn't trust the ground to hold her. Her name was Sarah Lindquist, a woman in her early 40s with a slim frame and a practical posture, bundled in a long wool coat and a pale scarf wrapped twice around her neck. She had light brown hair tucked under a knitted hat, a few strands escaping and catching snowflakes like tiny stars. Her skin was fair from the northern winter, cheeks pink with cold, and her eyes were the steady gray blue of someone who watched more than she spoke. Sarah wasn't like Rick. She didn't arrive with laughter. She arrived with curiosity and maybe a little worry. She stopped a respectful distance away and called out gently, "Sir, are you all right?" Walter paused again, leaning on the shovel. "I'm fine," he said. Sarah's gaze moved from the pit to the growing mound of dirt, then to Shadow sitting close by like a silent bodyguard. "That's a lot of digging," she said, careful not to sound insulting. Walter nodded, as if agreeing with a fact rather than defending a decision. "Winter's a lot of cold," he answered. Sarah hesitated, then stepped closer, her boots sinking slightly. "People in town are going to talk," she said, not as a threat, but as a warning, like someone pointing out thin ice. Walter's mouth twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. "They can talk," he said. "Talking doesn't keep you warm." Sarah looked at him longer now, as if she were seeing beyond the shovel and the dirt. She noticed the way he held himself, the discipline in his movements, the quiet certainty. "You were military," she said softly. It wasn't a question. Walter's eyes narrowed a fraction. Not angry, just guarded. "Yes," he said. Sarah nodded, understanding something without needing the details. "My father was too," she offered. "Different branch, but I recognize the way you measure things." Walter glanced at the slope again, at the sun's angle, at the wind direction. "Measuring keeps you alive," he said. Sarah's lips pressed together, and she gave a small, sympathetic smile that didn't ask for anything. "If you need anything," she said. "A thermos of coffee, extra gloves. I live on the next road over. Yellow house. You'll see a wind chime on the porch." Walter didn't respond right away. He wasn't used to kindness that didn't come with strings. But Shadow stood up and walked toward Sarah, sniffed her glove once, then sat again, calm and approving. Sarah laughed quietly, the sound soft against the harsh wind. "Well," she said, "I guess I've been vetted." Walter's voice came out lower, rougher than before. "Thank you," he said. Sarah nodded and left without another word, her footsteps disappearing into the snow. As the light began to fade, Walter kept digging. His arms ached, his back protested, and the cold crept into the places sweat had touched. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Not because he was proving something to the town. He was proving something to himself. the part of him that still carried the weight of old failures, the times he'd trusted the wrong people, the times he'd believed promises that turned out to be smoke needed a new kind of proof. Something real, something earned. Shadow stayed close, occasionally pacing the edge of the pit, occasionally standing on the mound of dirt to look out toward the distant lights of town like a sentinel. The dog's presence was steadying, like a heartbeat in the dark. When Walter finally drove the shovel into the ground and left it standing upright, he stepped back and stared at the pit. It wasn't deep yet. It wasn't impressive. It was just a beginning. But beginnings mattered. They were the first line of defense against everything that came next. He imagined the coming weeks, the deeper excavation, the support posts, the earth-packed walls, the entrance recessed from the wind. He imagined a trap door beneath the floor, a place where firewood could stay dry even when the world outside turned into a frozen graveyard. He imagined the day the blizzard would arrive, because it always arrived, and he imagined himself walking across his own floor, lifting the trap door, and bringing up dry wood without ever stepping into the storm. He pictured neighbors pounding on their frozen wood piles, cursing the ice, burning what they could, praying for warmth. He didn't want them to suffer, but he also didn't want to live his life saving people from choices they refused to think through. Walter looked down at Shadow, who gazed back with calm certainty. "We'll be ready," Walter murmured. Shadow's ears flicked, as if he understood the promise. Behind them, Duluth's wind howled like an old god laughing at human pride. Walter didn't laugh back. He simply turned toward his small trailer, shoulders squared, and walked into the dark with the quiet confidence of a man who had finally decided to build something that winter couldn't take away. Walter Bennett woke before sunrise, the kind of hour when the world still felt unfinished, and the cold hadn't yet decided how cruel it wanted to be. The slope outside his trailer looked the same as it had the day before, snow crusted over, wind combing the surface into ripples like a frozen ocean, but the air had changed. It carried that sharper edge that meant the season was tightening its grip. Shadow rose with him without being called, 5 years old and built like disciplined muscle wrapped in thick fur, his black and tan coat dark against the pale snow. The German shepherd's eyes stayed on Walter's hands as the old veteran pulled on his thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket, the fabric worn at the cuffs and elbows like it had been through battles of its own. Walter's movements were slow but deliberate, and there was a kind of ritual to them. Gloves, boots, scarf, the thermos he'd filled with bitter coffee, the ledger book he kept folded in a canvas satchel like a sacred text. That book wasn't filled with poetry or prayers. It was filled with measurements, sketches, and the quiet math of survival. He stepped out into the wind, and Shadow followed, paws landing soft and confident, leaving a neat trail behind him like a signature. The pit he'd started yesterday looked small in the morning light, but Walter didn't see small. He saw foundations. He stood at the edge and let his eyes map the slope again, measuring the sun's path, imagining where the wind would slam hardest, where snow would drift deepest. The town could laugh all it wanted, but Walter had learned something long ago. Winter didn't care about pride. Winter didn't care about jokes. Winter only cared whether a man had planned or whether he'd hoped. He climbed down into the excavation and began widening it, carving the earth as if he were shaping a hidden room inside a sleeping beast. Dirt came up in steady shovelfuls. The work warmed him from the inside out, sweat gathering beneath the flannel, his breath thick and white. Shadow stayed near the rim, ears pricked, occasionally circling as if checking for threats. Walter didn't talk to him much. He didn't need to. The dog understood his silence the way some people never could. By mid-morning, Walter had marked the rectangle of the living space with stakes and string. Compact, efficient, just enough for a stove, a bed, a small table, and the kind of quiet that didn't ask questions. He didn't want a home that impressed anyone. He wanted a home that stayed alive. The first real structure came next. Walter dragged over thick oak beams he'd bought cheap from a salvage yard on the edge of town. Wood that had once held up a warehouse roof and still smelled faintly of old dust and honest labor. He laid them out with care, tapping each piece with his knuckles like a doctor checking bones. Oak was stubborn wood, the kind that didn't surrender easily to rot or pressure, and Walter trusted stubborn things. He cut notches, measured spacing, and set the first vertical posts with stones at the base for drainage. It wasn't the kind of work you could rush. One mistake here wouldn't just look ugly, it would kill you later, when the earth shifted and the roof pressed down like the hand of a giant. Walter worked with the patience of someone who had once learned that panic wastes energy and energy is life. Around noon, the sound of boots crunching snow announced company. Rick Halverson showed up again. Same thick beard, same loud posture, carrying a half smirk like it was a tool in his belt. He wasn't alone this time. With him was another man, taller and leaner, in his early 30s, with a narrow face and a sharp nose that made him look like he'd been carved from a piece of wind-battered pine. His name was Cole Ramirez, a local handyman Rick liked to drag into other people's business. Cole had dark hair under a knit cap, stubble along his jaw, and hands that looked permanently stained with grease and sawdust. He didn't laugh as easily as Rick. His eyes were more cautious, like he'd learned not to mock things he didn't understand, because life had already humbled him once. "Well, I'll be damned," Rick called down into the pit. "He's still at it." Walter didn't answer right away. He adjusted a beam, checked the level, then finally looked up. His face was calm, but his eyes carried a warning. "Don't waste my time." Rick pointed at the posts. "You really think those are gonna hold? Earth pushes hard when it freezes." Walter's voice came out flat. "That's why they're oak, and why they're spaced right." Cole crouched at the edge, peering down, and his expression shifted. He wasn't impressed by stubbornness alone. He was impressed by precision. "You're setting them 6 feet on center," Cole said, more statement than question. Walter nodded once. Cole rubbed his chin, gaze flicking to the stones at the base. "And you're using rock for drainage. That's smart." Rick scoffed, but Cole kept studying the work like he was reading a language he respected. Walter saw it. The difference between a man who mocked to feel tall and a man who questioned because he wanted to learn. "You building a bunker?" Rick joked. "Planning on a war with the weather?" Walter's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Weather already declared war," he said. "Most people just pretend it didn't." That line landed heavier than Rick expected. The laughter in Rick's throat died into a cough. Cole glanced at Walter again, and for a second there was something like recognition in his eyes, like he'd met men like Walter before, men who spoke plainly because they'd run out of patience for performance. Rick shoved his hands into his coat and shrugged. "Suit yourself," he said. "Just don't come crying when you're flooded out in spring." Walter returned to his beam without answering. Cole stayed a moment longer. "You got a plan for moisture?" he asked quietly. Walter finally pulled the ledger book from his satchel and flipped it open. The pages were filled with neat handwriting and rough sketches, lines drawn firm and sure. "Drainage channel," Walter said, tapping the drawing. Clay pipe out to daylight. Pitch the floor slightly. Keep water moving away. Cole nodded slowly, impressed. You're serious? I'm alive, Walter replied. That's the same thing. Cole stood, gave a short nod of respect, and followed Rick back toward town. The wind swallowed their footsteps. Not long after, Sarah Lindquist arrived, walking carefully with a thermos tucked under her arm. She looked exactly as she had the day before. Slim, practical, fair-skinned, gray-blue eyes, steady as winter sky. But today her cheeks were redder from the cold, and there was a determination in her posture. She didn't come to watch like a tourist. She came to help. I brought coffee, she called softly, stopping at the edge of the pit. Shadow walked over to sniff her boots, then sat beside her like he'd decided she belonged here now. Walter climbed up, took the thermos with a quiet nod, and poured a cup into the lid. The coffee was hot enough to sting his fingers through the glove. He drank, and the warmth spread through him like a small mercy. You didn't have to, he said. Sarah shrugged, her breath fogging. I know, she replied. That's why I did. Walter looked at her longer than he meant to. There was something about Sarah's calm kindness that unsettled him, not because it was suspicious, but because it reminded him how long he'd lived without it. People are talking, Sarah said gently. Rick, especially. Walter's eyes narrowed slightly. Let them. Sarah hesitated, then asked the question she'd clearly been carrying since yesterday. Why here? Walter glanced at the slope, at the way the hill blocked the north wind, at the pale winter sun trying its best. Because the ground doesn't panic, he said. The ground holds steady. Sarah watched him, then looked down at the pit. You're building into the earth, she murmured, like she was speaking to an old story. Walter nodded. Earth keeps its temperature. Air doesn't. He took another sip of coffee, then handed the cup back. Sarah didn't leave right away. She stepped closer, peering at the ledger book when Walter opened it again. That's a lot of math, she said, half amused. Walter's voice softened, just a fraction. Math is cheaper than regret. Sarah smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. My dad used to say something similar, she admitted. He'd measure everything twice. Drove my mother crazy. Walter's gaze flicked up. Your father made it home? Sarah's smile faltered for a heartbeat. Yes, she said, then added quietly. But he came back different. Quieter. Walter nodded as if he understood too well. He didn't ask more. Some stories were like wounds, pressing them only made them bleed. Sarah looked down again, noticing the marked outline on the west side of the pit. What's that section? She asked. Walter's hand paused on the page. His eyes shifted toward Shadow, who sat watching the pit like it was a doorway to something sacred. Walter's voice dropped lower. That's the real reason I'm doing this, he said. Firewood storage. Under the floor. Sarah blinked. Under the floor? Walter nodded. Dry. Accessible. Protected. Sarah's eyebrows rose, and she let out a small laugh, not mocking, but impressed. That's actually brilliant. Walter didn't accept the compliment, like a man hungry for praise. He accepted it, like a man confirming a calculation. It's necessary, he said. People lose their wood to moisture, to snow, to distance. Then they lose their heat. Then they lose their choices. Sarah looked at him with a quiet seriousness now. And you've seen what happens when people lose choices, she said. Walter didn't answer directly. He stared out toward the frozen line of trees, jaw tightening. I've seen what happens when people think tomorrow is guaranteed, he said finally. Shadow stood and pressed his shoulder against Walter's leg. A gentle weight. A reminder that he wasn't alone in the present, even if the past still haunted him. Walter returned to work after Sarah left, and the day grew colder as the light faded. He built the framework like a man assembling a shield. He lined the first section of the lower chamber with creek stones he'd hauled in a sled, each rock placed carefully, clay packed between them. He carved a shallow pitch into the earth for drainage, already imagining the clay pipe that would carry meltwater away. He notched the beams slightly, not enough to invite a draft, but enough to let the space breathe. He built rock platforms 6 inches off the floor, because wood that stayed off damp ground stayed alive. Every detail had a reason. Every reason had a memory behind it. When the sun finally slipped behind clouds and the wind turned meaner, Walter climbed out of the pit, shoulders aching, hands stiff. He stood at the edge and looked down at what he'd made so far. A rough cavity in the hillside, posts rising like ribs, stone lining the beginnings of a hidden vault. It still looked like madness to anyone who didn't understand. But to Walter, it looked like the first chapter of a plan that Winter would be forced to respect. Shadow sat beside him, ears forward, watching the empty slope as if he could already hear the storm that hadn't arrived yet. Walter reached down and scratched behind the dog's ear, a rare gesture of tenderness. "We're building a promise," he murmured. The wind answered with a howl, and somewhere in town people laughed. Walter didn't. He simply turned back toward the work, because the earth was steady, and he intended to be too. The first real snow came the way bad news often does, quiet at the start, almost polite. Then suddenly everywhere, swallowing edges and sound, until the world looked like it had been erased and rewritten in white. Duluth woke under 6 inches overnight, and the wind off Lake Superior carried that damp bite that slipped through wool and found bone. Walter Bennett stepped outside before dawn, his boots crunching on fresh crust, his thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket already dusted with snow, as if winter had tried to claim him in his sleep. Shadow followed close, head low, breath steaming, his black and tan coat bristling against the cold like armor. The dog moved with that calm focus Walter trusted more than most human promises, ears up, eyes scanning, body loose but ready. The hillside looked different now. Snow made everything seem softer, but Walter knew softness was a disguise. Underneath, the ground was tightening, freezing, expanding in slow, invisible pressure. That was why he'd built the way he had, posts placed precisely, stone packed carefully, drainage planned like a lifeline. Today was the day he'd find out if his work was merely stubbornness or the beginning of safety. He ducked into the entrance of the dugout, now framed and braced, the roof beams set and covered enough to keep the worst of the snow from falling inside. The interior smelled like earth and wood and clay, raw, unfinished, but honest. It didn't smell like mildew, and that mattered. Walter knelt near the center of the floor and pulled at the edge of the trap door he'd installed the night before. The hatch lifted with a low creak, and cold air rose from below, not sharp and wet, but steady and clean, like the breath of the ground itself. Shadow stepped closer, sniffed the opening, then sat down as if standing guard over a secret vault in a temple. Walter climbed down carefully, boots finding the notched footholds he'd carved into the timber frame. The lower chamber, his firewood vault, waited in darkness, lined with creek stones mortared with clay and grass, the floor pitched gently toward the drainage channel. He held a lantern up, and the light caught on the rock platforms he'd built, 6 inches off the ground, and the stacks of wood laid neatly by size. The air down there wasn't warm, but it wasn't hostile either. It felt stable, controlled. Walter ran his gloved hand over the top log of one stack. Bone dry. He brought it to his nose and smelled oak and clean bark. Not rot, not damp. The corners of his mouth lifted slightly. Not quite a smile, but the kind of satisfaction a man feels when the world fails to prove him wrong. He took an armload, climbed back up, and closed the trap door flush with the floor. In the main room, he set the logs beside the small cast-iron stove, the same compact model he'd found at a farm auction outside town. It wasn't fancy. It was efficient. The kind of stove that didn't waste fuel on vanity. Walter struck a match. The flame caught instantly, bright and sharp in the dim space. He fed kindling in, then a split log, and within minutes the stove began to hum with heat. The dugout responded like a living thing, waking up, cold air lifting, walls releasing the steady temperature of the earth, the space becoming not just survivable but comfortable. Walter held his hands near the stove and felt the heat sink into his fingers. Outside, the wind howled, but inside the sound softened, muffled by sod and earth. It felt like being under the protection of something ancient and patient. Shadow lay down near the entrance, eyes half-lidded, ears still alert, the posture of a soldier who could rest only when the perimeter was secure. Walter sat on an overturned crate and listened to the stove crackle. For the first time in a long time, he felt the kind of peace that didn't require forgetting. It was earned peace built with shovel and stone and stubborn refusal to die. By mid-morning, the temperature dropped again, and the snow began to drift hard against fences and sheds across the neighborhood. Walter could hear the distant groan of wind in tree branches and the occasional sharp crack of ice shifting. He made coffee on the stove and ate a simple meal of bread and beans, then returned to small tasks, sealing gaps with clay, checking the beam joints, making sure the trap door sat tight. Each detail mattered. In war, details were the difference between coming home and becoming a name on a plaque. In winter, it was the same. The first sign that the town was struggling came in the form of sound faint at first, then clearer, the rhythmic chopping of an axe not far away, followed by a curse carried by the wind. Walter stepped outside and saw Rick Halverson in his yard, shoulders hunched, swinging an axe down onto what looked like a solid block of ice-covered wood. Rick's canvas coat flapped in the wind, his reddish beard frosted at the tips, and his face was the color of anger and cold. Each swing sent up chips of ice more than wood. Shadow stood beside Walter, watching with a stillness that almost felt judgmental. Walter didn't call out. He just observed. Rick's woodpile had been left uncovered, stacked like a proud monument to optimism. Now it was a frozen sculpture. Rick's axe bounced more than it bit. Walter watched the man's frustration build, the way it always did when reality refused to match ego. Rick finally stopped, leaned on the axe and spat into the snow. His breath came hard. He looked over and saw Walter standing by his dugout entrance, calm as a man watching weather on a porch. Rick's eyes narrowed. He walked over, boots stomping, carrying the axe like he wanted to argue with someone. "You warm in there?" Rick demanded. Walter's gaze flicked to the man's hands, barely gloved, knuckles red, fingers stiff. "Warm enough." Walter said. Rick's eyes shifted toward the dugout entrance, then back. My wood's frozen solid, he admitted, as if confession tasted bitter. Can't get a flame going. The damn stove smokes like a chimney in hell. Walter nodded once. Wet wood smokes, he said. Dry wood burns. Rick's jaw tightened. Yeah, I know that, he snapped. Then his voice softened by a fraction, almost unwillingly. How the hell is yours dry? Walter didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He just answered like a man stating a fact. It's underground, he said. Protected. Rick stared at him, and for a moment, the old mocking confidence drained out of his face. You really got a whole wood stash under your floor? Walter met his eyes. Yes. Rick looked away, embarrassed by how quickly his pride had turned into need. Must be nice, he muttered. Walter could have offered him wood. He could have played the hero and watched Rick's gratitude soften into admiration. But Walter had lived long enough to understand a hard truth. Saving someone once didn't teach them to save themselves. It just taught them to come back. Still, he wasn't cruel. He wasn't made of stone. He was made of scars, and scars remembered pain. If you want, Walter said, voice calm, I can show you the design. When the ground thaws, you can build your own vault. Rick's eyes flashed with irritation, then with something else, respect mixed with resentment. Spring's a long way off, he said. Walter's expression didn't change. Then you've got time to think, he replied. Rick stood there a moment longer, the wind tugging at his coat, his beard collecting more frost. Finally, he nodded stiffly and walked back to his yard without another word, axe dragging through the snow like a defeated flag. Later that afternoon, Sarah Lindquist arrived again, her cheeks flushed, her pale scarf pulled high, a small paper bag tucked under her arm. She looked tired today, not physically, but emotionally, as if she'd spent the morning hearing people complain and panic. She stopped at the dugout entrance and smiled faintly when Shadow trotted over and nudged her glove. I brought something, she said, holding out the bag. A few biscuits. Not for you, she added quickly, eyes flicking to Shadow. For your security guard. Walter took the bag, and Shadow sat politely, tail thumping once, like a dog who knew manners were part of his job. Sarah stepped inside the dugout, and the warmth surprised her. Her shoulders relaxed instantly, and she exhaled like she'd been holding her breath all day. It's warm, she said, voice low. Walter nodded. The earth helps, he replied. Sarah looked around at the packed walls, the low ceiling, the stove glowing steady. People are struggling already, she said. It's not even the worst part of winter yet. Walter's gaze drifted to the small window where snow swirled like ghosts. It never starts with the worst, he said. It starts with the first mistake. Sarah's eyes softened. Rick? She guessed. Walter didn't answer directly, but his silence was confirmation. Sarah stepped closer to the stove, holding her hands out. My neighbor across the road, she said. Mrs. Deanna Price, she's older, late 70s. Lives alone since her husband passed. She's been burning damp wood all morning. Her house smells like smoke and sadness. Walter looked at Sarah, and for a moment something old and heavy shifted in his chest. Not pity. Responsibility. The kind he'd tried to set down years ago, but couldn't. Does she have help? He asked. Sarah shook her head. Her son lives in Minneapolis. Roads are getting bad. Walter nodded slowly. the gears, cars turning behind his eyes. "I'll check on her," he said. Sarah looked relieved, then guilty, as if she hated asking. "You don't have to," she began. Walter cut her off gently. "I know," he said. "That's why I will." When Sarah left, Walter pulled on his flannel jacket again and stepped out with Shadow at his side. The wind had picked up, pushing snow in waves. They walked toward the cluster of houses nearby, where smoke rose unevenly from chimneys, some steady, some choking. Walter stopped once and looked back at his dugout entrance recessed into the slope, already half hidden by drifting snow. It looked small from the outside, unimpressive, almost like nothing. But inside, it was warmth, dry fuel, and control. That contrast hit him hard. A man could look poor and still be prepared. A man could look stable and still be one frozen mistake away from disaster. Walter tightened his jaw and kept walking. Behind him, the town's laughter had thinned, replaced by something colder and more honest. Fear. And fear, Walter knew, was the beginning of learning. If it didn't turn into pride first. The blizzard didn't arrive like a storm, it arrived like a verdict. Duluth had been tense for days, the sky hanging low and gray as if the world itself was holding its breath. And then one afternoon, the air went strangely still. No wind, no birds, no distant traffic hum, only that quiet that made the back of Walter Bennett's neck tighten. He stepped outside his dugout and stared toward Lake Superior's invisible edge, feeling the pressure change in his ears like a warning from an old wound. Shadow stood beside him, 5 years old and built for endurance, his ears upright and swiveling, his nose testing the air. The dog's tail was low, not afraid, but alert in the way a seasoned guard becomes when something unseen approaches. Walter didn't need a weather report. He'd seen this kind of stillness before, in deserts before sandstorms, in forests before artillery, in human faces before bad news. He went back inside and began moving with controlled urgency, the same quiet discipline that had carried him through nights when survival depended on minutes. He brought extra wood up from the trapdoor vault, stacking it close to the stove in neat rows, more than he'd need for a day, enough for a week if the world went cruel. He filled every container he owned with water, checked the clay seals along the wall seams, and reinforced a couple of spots with rags where the wind had started to whistle faintly through. Shadow followed him from corner to corner like a shadow of his own thoughts, then finally sat near the entrance, facing outward as if daring the storm to try its luck. When the first flakes began to fall, they were almost gentle, drifting down through the stillness like ash. Walter watched through the small window, his face unreadable, the stove already warming the space. By the time the snow thickened, the wind returned, but not the ordinary wind that teased the trees and pushed clouds around like lazy cattle. This wind screamed. It hit the hillside like a battering ram and made the earth tremble, not enough to shake the structure, but enough to remind Walter that nature didn't negotiate. The snow came sideways now, thick as flour thrown into the air, and visibility collapsed from 100 yards to 50 to nothing. The world outside became a white wall that erased distance, erased direction, erased the confidence of anyone foolish enough to step into it. Walter listened as the storm wrapped itself around the dugout. The sound was muffled, but the pressure was constant, like waves pounding the hull of a ship. The temperature dropped fast. He could feel it in the way the stove's heat seemed to work harder, in the way his breath lingered longer in the air before vanishing. Shadow's ears twitched at every change in pitch outside, and once the dog let out a low, warning growl, Not at something he saw, but at something he sensed, an instinct older than words. Walter kept the fire steady. He didn't overfeed it. He didn't panic and burn through wood like a man trying to outrun fear. He fed it the way he'd built everything else, measured, deliberate, confident. The warmth held, not tropical comfort, not summer ease, but a steady, sheltering heat that kept hands working and mind clear. Outside, the blizzard was chewing through the town. Walter could hear it in the distance, even through earth, and sawed occasional sharp cracks, likely tree limbs snapping under ice, and once, a deep groan that might have been a shed roof giving up. Somewhere out there, families were learning what record cold really meant. The kind of cold that turned breath into needles. The kind of cold that made a stove useless if the wood was wet and the chimney froze shut. The kind of cold that punished every lazy decision made in autumn. Around dusk, Sarah Lindquist's face flickered in Walter's mind, her steady gray-blue eyes and her quiet kindness. He thought of the older woman she'd mentioned, Deanna Price, living alone with damp wood and smoke-filled rooms. Walter didn't like thinking about people suffering, but he didn't like the helplessness of it more. He pulled on his thick flannel jacket and opened the door a crack to check the drift. The wind tried to rip the door from his hands. Snow shoved itself inside like an invading army. He slammed it shut and leaned his forehead against the wood for a second, breathing slowly. Going out now would be suicide. Walter had learned long ago that courage and stupidity often wore the same face. Shadow pressed against his leg, steadying him, and Walter scratched behind the dog's ear with a gloved hand. "Not tonight," he murmured, half to Shadow, half to the storm. "Tonight we wait." Night fell fully, and with it came the deepening cold. The wind found every tiny imperfection in the dugout's seams and tried to whistle its way inside. Walter stuffed rags into the smallest gaps and tightened the clay in places where the wall had shrunk slightly. The inside temperature dipped, then stabilized again as he fed the stove another log from the stack he'd pulled up from the vault. Every log caught clean, burning hot without struggle, and each time Walter opened the stove door, the fire flared like it was grateful to be given dry fuel. He sat back down on his crate, watching the flames. His face looked carved by the firelight, shadows deepening the lines at his eyes and the scar near his brow. The truth was, he'd built this shelter for himself, yes, but also for the part of him that still carried guilt. Guilt for men he couldn't save. Guilt for choices he made when he was younger and desperate. Guilt for surviving when others didn't. In the army, he'd learned to live with that guilt like a stone in his pocket, always there, always heavy. But here, in this dugout, he felt something different. Control. Not control over the world, but control over his own readiness. That alone was a kind of redemption. Then, near midnight, it happened. A sound cut through the storm's howl, faint at first, almost impossible, then clearer. Knocking. Not wind, not a branch. Knuckles on wood. Walter froze, every muscle tightening, mind racing through possibilities. Shadow sprang to his feet instantly, teeth bared, a low growl vibrating from his chest like thunder in a cave. Walter raised a hand, palm down, calming the dog without a word. He moved toward the door slowly, listening. Another knock. Desperate, uneven. Walter's instincts screamed caution. The storm could kill a man in minutes out there. If someone was knocking, they were either very brave, very stupid, or very close to dying. Walter cracked the door open just enough to see a shape beyond the drifting snow, hunched and shaking. "Walter!" a voice shouted, nearly swallowed by the wind. "It's Rick!" Rick Halverson stumbled forward, face raw and red, beard packed with ice, eyes wide with panic. Behind him, another figure clung to his shoulder for balance. Cole Ramirez, his lean face pale under the frost, his knit cap pulled low, stubble coated in ice crystals. Cole's hands looked stiff, fingers curled like claws from cold. Both men were breathing hard, and their clothes were crusted with snow as if they'd been dragged through a frozen river. Walter opened the door wider, and the wind tried to shove them back out. Shadow barked once, sharp and warning, but stepped aside when Walter motioned. Rick half fell inside, stumbling over the threshold. Cole followed, bracing himself on the wall, eyes blinking rapidly as warmth hit him like a shock. The door slammed shut, and the dugout became quiet again, except for their ragged breathing and the steady crackle of fire. Rick's bravado was gone. He looked smaller now. Not physically, he was still thick and broad, but spiritually, like a man who had been humbled by something too big to fight. His cheeks were blotched with cold, and his lips were cracked. "My chimney froze," Rick rasped. Smoke backed up, house filled. Kids were coughing. Couldn't see. Couldn't breathe. His voice broke on the last word, and Walter saw the terror behind his anger. Cole leaned forward, hands on knees, trying to catch his breath. "We tried to dig out the woodpile," Cole said, voice strained but controlled. "It's buried under drift. Solid ice, we couldn't get to it." Walter nodded slowly, his mind already calculating. "Your family?" he asked Rick. Rick swallowed hard. "Sarah's got them," he said. "She opened her house. She's keeping them warm. But she told me to come here." Walter's eyes narrowed. "She sent you into this?" Rick shook his head quickly. "No," he said, ashamed. "I begged her. I didn't know where else to go. I was wrong, Walter. I was wrong about everything." Walter didn't respond to the apology yet. He looked at Cole. The younger man's eyes met his, steady despite the cold. Cole wasn't proud, but he wasn't pathetic either. He was simply honest. "We're not here to take your wood," Cole said. "Not to beg for charity. We're here because we need to understand what you built. Because this storm isn't done." Walter studied them both. The firelight flickered across their faces, Rick's fear, Cole's determination. Shadow stood close to Walter's leg, watching, still tense but quieter now, like a judge waiting for a verdict. Walter could have turned them away. He could have protected his resources and let pride punish them. But Walter wasn't interested in revenge. Revenge didn't keep anyone alive. He also wasn't interested in being a saint. Saints got used up. Walter was interested in something else, changing the pattern. If Rick and Cole learned now, maybe next winter fewer people would suffer. Maybe that would matter. Walter moved to the stove, poured hot water into 2 tin cups and handed them over. "Drink," he said. "Warm up first. Then I'll show you." Rick's hands shook so badly, he nearly spilled the cup. Cole held his with both hands like it was a lifeline. Walter knelt at the trap door and pulled it open. Warm air from the room met the stable, cool air below. "This," Walter said, voice steady, "is the difference between panic and preparation." He didn't climb down yet. He didn't give them the full tour. Not tonight. Tonight was for survival, for breath, for warmth. But the door was open. The secret was no longer a secret. Outside, the blizzard kept screaming. Inside, the men who once mocked him sat by his fire, and the laughter that had filled the town in September had finally died, replaced by the kind of respect that only winter could teach. The storm loosened its grip the way a bully sometimes does, suddenly, without apology, leaving behind wreckage as proof of its power. When morning finally came to Duluth, the sky looked bruised and pale, the kind of color that didn't promise warmth but did promise visibility. The wind had dropped from a scream to a bitter whisper, yet the cold remained vicious, the kind that made exposed skin sting like it had been slapped. Walter Bennett waited until the light grew stronger before opening his door. He moved with the same caution he'd shown all winter, because he knew the world outside didn't become safe just because the storm got bored. Shadow stood beside him, shoulders squared, ears forward, breath rolling out in thick clouds. The German shepherd's paws sank into snow that had drifted nearly up to Walter's knees, but the dog didn't hesitate. Shadow looked like he belonged to the storm more than any human ever could, black and tan fur thick as a coat, eyes sharp, body built for endurance, moving like a guardian spirit with muscle and instinct instead of wings. Walter stepped out and scanned the neighborhood. Fences had disappeared beneath drifts. Cars were half buried like forgotten toys. A shed roof down the slope had collapsed. The boards twisted and splintered, snow piled on top like a grave marker. Smoke rose from some chimneys in weak, uneven trails. From others, nothing. That silence was more frightening than the wind. It meant cold houses. It meant people inside holding their breath and praying the next hour didn't kill them. Walter's flannel jacket, red and black buffalo plaid, stood out against the white world like a warning flag. He didn't care. He wasn't dressed for blending in. He was dressed for living. Behind him, Rick Halverson and Cole Ramirez emerged from the dugout, both looking like men who had been dragged back from the edge of something they didn't want to name. Rick's face was still raw from cold, beard clumped with melted ice that had refrozen into gritty crystals. Cole's eyes were clearer now, his breathing steadier, but his hands still shook slightly when he flexed his fingers, like his body was remembering how close it came to failing. Walter didn't let them linger in gratitude or shame. "Your families," he said, voice firm. "Go check them." Rick nodded hard, swallowing pride like it was medicine. "Sarah's got them," he repeated. But now the words carried something different, respect, and maybe even gratitude he didn't know how to express without sounding weak. Cole looked at Walter and hesitated. "You're coming?" he asked. Walter's gaze moved across the buried landscape. "I'm checking on Deanna Price," he said. "You can help by not getting yourself killed again." Cole almost smiled, the smallest twitch at the corner of his mouth, then nodded. They split up, boots crunching through drifts, each step a fight. Walter moved toward the yellow house Sarah had described, and as he walked, he saw evidence of how the storm had sorted the town into categories: the prepared, the lucky, and the desperate. A man down the road hacked at a snowbank with a shovel, his shoulders jerking in exhausted anger. A woman stood on a porch wrapped in blankets, her hair wild, face pale, staring at the street like she was waiting for someone who might not come. Shadow stayed close to Walter's leg, not pulling ahead now, not scouting. The dog sensed the mood in the air, the way fear clung to everything like frost. When Walter reached Deanna Price's small home, he saw the front steps nearly buried. The porch light flickered weakly. He knocked once, then again. The door opened slowly, and Deanna appeared like a ghost wrapped in wool. She was in her late 70s, short and thin, with silver hair pinned back in a loose bun that had come undone in places, strands falling around her face like cobwebs. Her skin looked papery and pale, cheeks hollowed by age and worry. Her eyes were watery but sharp, the eyes of a woman who had lived long enough to recognize danger and pride in equal measure. Behind her, the air smelled faintly of smoke and damp wood. "Who is it?" she asked, voice trembling but not helpless. Walter removed his hat and spoke gently. "Walter Bennett. Sarah asked me to check on you." Deanna blinked, her gaze flicking to Shadow, who sat politely at Walter's side like a trained escort. "I don't need charity," she said immediately, chin lifting. Walter nodded as if he'd expected that exact line. "Good," he replied. "Neither do I. I'm not here to give you charity. I'm here to make sure you don't freeze." Deanna's lips tightened, but she stepped back enough to let him in. Inside, the house was cold, colder than it should have been, and the stove in the corner looked like it had been fought with all night and lost. Walter crouched by the wood basket and touched a log. Damp. He didn't criticize. He didn't lecture. He simply stood, walked to the door, and called Shadow in. "Stay," Walter told the dog softly. Shadow sat, ears forward, eyes watching Deanna like he was guarding her pride as carefully as her life. Walter returned to his dugout and brought back a small bundle of dry, split wood. Not a cord, not a donation that would turn into dependence just enough to restart a fire properly. When he returned, Deanna watched him with narrowed eyes. "You think you're some kind of savior?" she asked, bitterness covering fear like a coat. Walter set the wood down gently. "No," he said. "I'm a man who doesn't like funerals." Deanna's expression cracked for a second, and Walter saw the grief beneath it. She had lost people. She had buried winters in her bones. He lit the stove with careful steps, feeding it dry kindling first, then a split log. The flame caught instantly, bright and clean. Warmth began to spread, slow but real. Deanna stared at the fire like she couldn't believe something so simple could still work. Walter stood and wiped his hands on his jeans. "This is why dry wood matters," he said, not as a lecture, but as a fact. Deanna swallowed and looked away. "My husband always handled it," she whispered. Walter's gaze softened. "Then he loved you," he said. Deanna's eyes glistened, and she nodded once, small and fragile. Walter didn't stay long. He left her with warmth and dignity intact. Outside, he moved through the neighborhood with Shadow, checking on houses where smoke didn't rise. Some doors opened to grateful faces. Others opened to suspicion. Some didn't open at all until Shadow barked, and Walter called out calmly, refusing to leave until he knew someone inside was alive. By midday, the storm's aftermath became a kind of quiet parade. People emerged like survivors from bunkers. They looked at Walter's dugout entrance half buried in snow, and for the first time, nobody laughed. They stared at it the way people stare at something that embarrassed them yesterday, but might save them tomorrow. Sarah appeared in the street, bundled in her wool coat and pale scarf, her hair tucked under her knit hat, cheeks flushed from the cold and from the long night of sheltering Rick's children. She looked exhausted but steady, the kind of woman whose kindness didn't come from softness, but from strength. When she saw Walter, she walked toward him, careful through the drifts. "They made it," she said quietly, meaning Rick's family, meaning Deanna, meaning more than just one household. Walter nodded once. "Good," he said. Sarah looked at the dugout entrance and then back at Walter. "People want to talk to you," she said. Walter's jaw tightened. About what? Sarah's mouth curved into the smallest smile. About how you did it, she replied. About how you stayed warm. About how your wood didn't turn into ice. Walter let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh, dry and humorless. They didn't want to talk when I was digging, he said. Sarah's eyes held his. No, she agreed. But winter has a way of teaching faster than pride. That afternoon, it happened the way legends always begin, not with trumpets, but with awkward footsteps and people who didn't know how to apologize without choking on it. Tobias Keir arrived first, not because he was the kindest, but because he was the kind of man who respected facts more than feelings. Tobias was in his early 60s, tall and wiry with a narrow face, deep-set eyes, and a gray mustache trimmed neatly as if order itself comforted him. He wore a heavy coat and carried a small notebook and pencil, the tools of a man who planned. He stood at Walter's entrance and cleared his throat. "Mr. Bennett," he said, voice careful, "I'd like to see your storage system, if you're willing." Walter studied him, remembering the skepticism, the warnings, the quiet doubt. Tobias didn't look ashamed, but he did look serious, and seriousness mattered more than shame. "Come in," Walter said. Behind Tobias came others men, and women with tired faces, red noses, and eyes that had stared too long into cold rooms. Rick stood among them, arms crossed, jaw tight, as if daring anyone to mention his earlier laughter. Cole stood slightly apart, hands in pockets, watching like a man who wanted to learn without turning it into theater. Walter didn't turn the moment into a speech. He didn't stand on a crate and preach. He simply opened his ledger book on the small table and laid out the drawings like a map. "This is the vault," he said, tapping the page. 4 feet down minimum, stone lining, drainage channel pitched out, platforms off the floor, ventilation notches small. He looked at the group, his pale eyes steady. "Not complicated," he added. "Just precise." Tobias began writing immediately, pencil scratching fast. A woman near the back asked, voice shaky, "Will it work under a shed?" Walter nodded. "If you keep drainage right," he said, "and if you can access it without walking into a storm." Someone else asked about mold. Walter pointed to the ventilation notches. "Earth breathes," he said. "You let it breathe without letting it draft." Rick shifted his weight, then finally spoke, voice rough. "And if you don't do it?" Walter looked at him, not cruel, not smug, just honest. "Then you keep gambling," Walter said, "and winter keeps collecting." There was a silence after that, the kind of silence that meant the message landed. Sarah stood near the door, watching, and Walter caught her eye for a moment. In that look was something almost mythic, like she'd witnessed a transformation, not of a man, but of a whole street. Mockery had turned into respect, not because Walter demanded it, but because the storm demanded proof, and Walter had delivered it quietly. When the group finally left, carrying notes and measurements and a new kind of humility, Walter stood outside with Shadow. The dog leaned against his leg, warm and solid, and Walter rested a hand on the shepherd's head. Across the neighborhood, people were already looking at their yards differently, not as property, but as potential. Places to dig, places to prepare, places to stop trusting luck. Walter watched them and felt something he hadn't expected, not pride, but relief, because the burden of being the only prepared one was heavy. And maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't have to carry it alone next time. In the end, Walter Bennett never called himself a hero, and Shadow never asked for applause. They simply did what the cold demanded. They prepared, they endured, and they stayed human when the world turned white and merciless. And maybe that's the quiet miracle right there. Not thunder from the heavens, not a sudden fortune falling into someone's lap, but the kind of grace God places in ordinary hands. Wisdom to plan, courage to keep digging, and the strength to keep a fire burning when everything outside is trying to go out. Because sometimes the miracle isn't that the storm disappears. It's that God gives someone the discipline to be ready before it arrives. And when Walter opened that trap door and pulled up dry wood in the middle of a blizzard, it wasn't just engineering. It was a reminder that preparation can be a form of faith. Faith is not only praying for warmth. Faith is stacking the wood. Faith is sealing the cracks. Faith is choosing responsibility when nobody is watching and everyone is laughing. So if you're going through your own winter right now, financial stress, loneliness, heartbreak, fear, remember this: the ground beneath you is still steady. You can still build, you can still repair, you can still rise, one small shovel of effort at a time, until your life becomes a shelter instead of a struggle. And if this story touched your heart, take a second to share it with someone who needs hope today. Comment below and tell us where you're watching from and what storm you're facing in your own life. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that remind us how strong the human spirit can be, especially when God is guiding it quietly in the background. May God bless you, protect your home, warm your heart, and keep you and your loved ones safe through every season. Amen.